So Jennifer, Debbie has indicated that teachers should have a kind of creative non-compliance, or even be, as she put it, a little bit subversive. Could you comment a little bit on that, or share with us your perspective on how that might play out with teachers? Yeah, that wasn't very clear, was it? Well, this notion of creative non-compliance, and I think really, what it really gets to is, again, this notion that teachers should have some autonomy in the classroom. They should be able to, in some cases, resist and kind of, as some have put it, swim upstream or teach against the grain is another term used.
They're collectively. And also,
okay, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
And should do so collectively. Okay, so how can we prepare teachers on the one hand to have that sort of disposition, and on the other hand, kind of do the other things that they would need to do? What do you think?
Sometimes I think we do it to ourselves, because young teachers come in and they're ready to go, or you have that middle of the road that have been revitalized because of whatever purpose, and you have peers around them or administrators that sometimes have a thumb on folks. So sometimes we do it to ourselves, but sometimes there are policies doing it to us. So I think it's a combination, not that I disagree with anything being said, but sometimes you are under the umbrella of some of that restrains us from doing that, or we would have a lot more of it. I mean, that's the reality of education right now, whether we like it or not. So, but I think that, we would all like more autonomy, and I think we have a little more flexibility, but I want to talk about the technology piece and how that fits into this conversation. With technology, I think it allows for more of that. I think it is an equity, it helps with the equity gap with students, but I also think it helps with that with teachers. And so I think utilizing that to your leverage, and that goes back to being nimble with the changes happening in the classroom, whether we like them or not, it is evolving, and it's evolving fast. But utilizing the resources and the tools that you are being provided and that you can seek out to seek out that autonomy. I think many of our current the things that are playing into the classroom right now, I think does lend itself to that if we take advantage of it. But technology is really tricky right now in the classroom, and I just have to put this piece out there because I'm going across the state and I'm watching it happen. We better be aware of making sure we are educating our students on their technology citizenship and their responsibilities surrounding that. So making sure they understand your digital blueprint, and students who are in the pipeline now, you better watch your own because other people are watching it. And when you go try to find a job, we are going to look you up and see what you're doing. So make sure that we are being very diligent in educating students on the power of technology and moving the conversation from technical to more innovation, which gets right back to that autonomy. And I think we're getting there. But I think using that technology, I know you mentioned that technology piece in the classroom right now is a great opportunity to embrace that for innovation, and also to provide opportunities for students that maybe they weren't afforded without it. So it goes back to that equity gap and making sure it gives us a piece of opportunity to address that.
It's also a risk, because we can rely on technology to replace human judgment. And it's easier to do today. I mean, there are a lot of classrooms in which the teacher is the monitor of the classroom, but the computer is doing the teaching. And maybe the computer has been given an algorithm doing whatever they do, so that it fits each student. This student needs this part of math, and this student needs that. But the judgment, the act of judgment, is in the part of the machine has been trained to have a judgment that is some other person's judgment. You can't question and you can't argue with. And it scares me to think to what degree we have turned over to a mechanical technological to make human decisions, to prioritize, to decide what's more important than what else, to do all those acts that seem to work magically through the box. I used to like to explain to kids, even 5-year-olds, why we were talking about this today. why that happened, or stop suddenly the class as they're doing different things and say, I just want you all to come over here and look at what Jane did. It's so fascinating. Jane explained it. All of that interchange, I don't see happening in modern schools, and I think too many teachers are becoming technological experts, but they've left the judgment to the machine. And in some cases, they're forced to. Now, when I first taught kindergarten, would be long before I thought I would stick with it, I was supposed to teach, God knows where they got this idea, Los Angeles and Tokyo, to 5-year-olds, mind you. So that was supposed to be our curriculum. And so I switched Los Angeles to Chicago, and I had a little fun with Tokyo because the principal was ancestry was Japanese, and we played with ways of showing how different things were. And along came a person from downtown to say, "What are you doing? This was supposed to be Los Angeles." And then you aren't supposed to be focusing on the differences between Chicago and Japan, but why they're really the same. And I argued with her about if it's the same, what's the point of studying it? I want kids to want to go to Japan, where some things are different. And in any case, we had this argument, children heard us, and when she left, my colleagues, as I was a first-year teacher, my colleagues all came out and taught me that you're supposed to pretend to listen to her and say, "Oh, thank you, that's very helpful." She goes away, she never comes back. There's no point arguing with her. She didn't make these decisions any more than she thinks you should make these decisions. It is a systemic problem, and I know that superintendents are in the same bind that the classroom teacher. And vital decisions are made elsewhere. And citizens, parents, citizens, communities need to ask themselves whether that's an appropriate way to raise a democratic generation. I don't want kids to very often hear, "Oh, I had to do it that way, I had no choice," from adults. Occasionally you have to say that, but I would like it to be a small part of their education, not that, I have to do what the machine tells me, I have to do what downtown tells me. So I don't know. I think the situation is different today than it was when I started. I think that's true. And I'm not sure I could have survived what we're facing today. I hope I could have been as disobedient as I was 60 years ago. But I'm not sure. But I think that's the fundamental problem facing us, whether it's democracy or the modern technology, is to figure out how to grasp and hold on to the power to make decisions, to weigh the evidence, and to influence the world we live in.
Let me shift this a little bit. Both of you have mentioned a couple of things here. One, Debbie, you mentioned something about your concern that teachers don't know how to invent the curriculum, which I assume means that they're not really well prepared to be curriculum makers or curriculum creators as they enter the classroom. And then, Jennifer, you mentioned that we've both been talking about technology. It seems to me that what I gained from that is that teachers need to be intelligent consumers of technology and users of technology, not necessarily embrace it without a lot of good judgment and thought. So let's turn to something that we do here in this building, which is teacher education. Could either of you address the topic of what should teacher education, pre-service teacher education, do to better prepare our graduates to deal with this notion of inventing the curriculum on the one hand and adequate and appropriate use of technology? Debbie, you want to talk about teacher education?
It's a huge subject, isn't it? There was a wonderful book written by a man named Jay Featherstone. Write that down, Jay Featherstone. I don't remember the title, and he's written more than one book. It was about an experiment, I think, at the University of Michigan, or it was Michigan State, probably Michigan State. And they did something that I really think is brilliant. They you know, I'm part of the small schools movement. So they made the education department, which was a very big department, and they broke it into a bunch of little small schools so that teachers, would-be teachers, were part of a smaller cluster of 5, 6, 7 faculty members, and they functioned as a professional community, students and faculty, and they took on a project of working with a school to solve problems that that school was concerned with. And the students and the teachers examined the school, spent time there, met with people, tried to collectively come up with solutions to the school's problem. And I thought that was marvelous, and I think it probably brings up issues of curriculum and school management and discipline in the course of trying to think through with the school how to solve its problem. And also put students in the company, just as I'd like to put young people in the company, of adults who are engaged in professional problem solving. And I think schools of education generally share all the faults of K-12 education. And I think we need to basically rethink the relationship between the faculty and the students in graduate school in general, but particularly in schools of education.
I'll be honest with you. I came from a district that was very mid-sized for Indiana. We had about 2,400 students, so it's for Indiana, that's just a mid-sized district. And we struggled in this area. So part of it is, you have students coming out of higher education that are being prepared one way, and then as once you hit the district level, it becomes a whole other set of problems. And there's a disconnect between that. And I don't necessarily have the answer, or I would be sharing that answer, but I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all at the university to address that concern. I know part of it is when we just look at the holistic curriculum and then you start diving into our standards, and Indiana standards and all the indicators that layer it up is part of the problem. It's hard to have a really good conversation about the holistic curriculum when we're up against what we're up against with just the piece of our state standards. I mean, they're just layered upon layered, and it's time, it's a matter of resources. And I know no matter how much you say, we're gonna make that a commitment, and we are gonna get it right as educators, you still have guardrails around that. So I don't know if I have a really good answer, but it is a problem that I think needs further discussion. There are just so many factors playing into that right now that it makes it very difficult. So it's not really a blame game that higher ed's doing it incorrectly, but I think it's much bigger than that, and that conversation needs to keep going.
Yeah, I think what I would take from both of your responses here is that there needs to be greater linkages between schools and the schools of education. That what we do has to be in some ways congruent, or at least a kind of cooperation, so that we're making sure that on the one hand our students are aware of the realities of schools, and on the other hand we might have some influence then on some of the ideas that are being promoted in schools. It's sort of a two-way street. I think that kind of collaboration is critical. I'm looking at the time here, and I wanted to be able to offer an opportunity for some questions from the audience as we have our guests here today. And I know that some of our students have classes, because students do have classes, and some of them have to leave. So I think now might be a good time for us to open it up a little bit. Particularly, I'll call upon our students if you have questions, because those of you who have to leave in a few minutes, I'd like to give you that opportunity. But then everyone will have a chance to ask a question or two. Yes.
Hello.
Oh, yes, we have the mic so everyone can hear.
I am going into secondary social studies education, and something within our field is starting to be the emphasis of drawing away from the textbooks and bringing a lot more other resources, whether it's secondary sources or primary resources. And with that, then I'm still seeing the struggle, and what I foresee going into my first year is almost having to rely on the textbook for the curriculum before being able to find that footing. But I guess the question I have then is, how could we start pulling away from textbooks, or do you feel that's something that needs to be required, just because in the social studies field there's a lot of resources and information that is left out in order to make the citizen, whether it's a democratic one or an obedient one that is to our current national standards.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And so it's interesting right now because when I go into schools, some of them, and this isn't necessarily criticism, but they're like, hey, we're one-to-one computers and we got rid of textbooks, and it's like a pride. And I'm not sure that's sending the right message because they're tools. They're tools for instruction. You're going to still use books. You're still going to pull from all different types of sources. You're still going to use the internet. You're going to really pull sources. You're going to talk to people. You're going to use all different sources, but we come down to a state that's like it's either one or the other, and that emphasis is heavy. And so the learning management systems are playing into that discussion as well, and how you develop your own type of curriculum and what that looks like for online courses and the hybrid courses. So that conversation's going. I think for all of us that have been at it a while, we know we have to rely on a lot of resources and a lot of materials to pull from. I hope as a state we don't come down to we are a technology laptop state only, and that's because when it comes down to resources, that's the problem with the funding. Now that we can put our textbook monies into technology, it has really spun off on that's great, but that doesn't mean textbooks are bad. I think we're sending the wrong message to say that type of poll or that type of resource is a bad resource. Some are outdated, absolutely, but some aren't. So there are some things that you can teach and it looks the same through the ages, and there are other things that change drastically. So just to throw it all out, I think is irresponsible of us. But I would encourage you, as you hit the classroom, you pull from all different resources, and you will have folks around you who can help with that. But just knowing there's not one size that fits all with that.
I was thinking that it would be nice to try out imagining how you would study if you were just a citizen. How would you study what decisions to make in Syria? I just found out we bombed them last night. But how to study that? Well, it would be interesting to start with the newspapers sometimes, or with the newspapers of another period of history, and then think about what kind of knowledge is missing in that. What would you have to find out? And ignoring both textbooks and pre-programmed technology, to think about if we're confronted by this situation, what's the kind of evidence we need in order to help us make decisions? And think about that process, and then see where can you find that evidence. In textbooks, in just plain books, in biographies, in the computer technology. How does one go about solving a problem that one is confronted with, rather than, that's what I think we get stuck on, where we don't imagine that this is a process that's going to go on for the rest of our lives. We don't, generally speaking, go to the textbook, although we might. But how does one find out, how does one weigh different evidence that conflict with each other? That's, I think, the process that we need to do more in school, which is carry on that conversation first before you go to look for the evidence. And then when you come back, and students come back with it, to argue about who has better sources, why is this a good source, and what does it suggest to us about where we need to go next.
Yeah, we emphasize problem-based learning a lot. So in social studies and history and so on, there are plenty of problems we can pose to students, and that they can then generate the resources or find the resources and then do some analysis of those. So, and the textbook might be one.
Yeah, you usually get this only in University of Chicago. I was a history major in the University of Chicago graduate school. That was the kind of thing that professors would have us do, is to take some established or some possible fact in history and track back how sure are we that really happened and what was the evidence. And it was a fascinating process. We were like detectives, which I think is an enormous part of what a citizen does. He has to try to figure out, so-and-so says this, so-and-so says that. How can I go about weighing this?
I just have to say, I'm not not trying to discourage anyone because I want you all in education, but I think this is where we do ourselves a disservice because the job is complex and it's difficult. So in social studies, you are probably going to walk in, if you walk into a traditional high school, middle school, you're going to probably have 30 plus kids sitting there, many with an IEP, some that don't speak English as a first language. So you're trying to manage and get your feet on the ground with that, and then you're trying to figure out your instructional approaches and the content. And so there are times where I see new teachers do it. They get out, they're all energized, and they go back and rely on something that is somewhat secure and it's somewhat reliable, and until you can, it takes time. It takes time to master what you're doing in the classroom. So you're gonna have to remember that as you go on. Don't give up year one, like, I can't manage all this, I'm trying to pull all these different resources, because you're gonna, I mean, it's very complex, it's very difficult. So utilize those around you, but no, it'll come. You're gonna get much better at it as you go and you get experience. But you're gonna have a lot coming at you as a first year teacher. I've seen it firsthand. And it's not easy, and I think as a field, we just don't talk about it enough. You know, we just think that first 5 years is going to be super simple, and it's just not. So you just are going to have to know you're on the right track of thinking there are multiple, things to pull from, and so I commend you for just that. But there are just, when you get in that situation, sometimes you're like, I got to have a go-to. Because you have so much coming at you. So it'll take some time. I don't want anyone to think you're going to get out of here and be perfect year one. It just does not happen.
Which is why the group will all have 20 years. And each year you discover some new things. That's what makes it such a wonderful experience. I've never been before.
Well, thank you. And hi, Deb. My name is Polly and Jennifer. Debbie, I especially want to say, just to hear you talk is like a balm to my soul. The idea that you use imagination and that the rhetoric is that we are not stuck with what we currently have, and that even these policies that feel so stable and stagnant, they're not being done to us. Like we're deciding. So thank you for encouraging that conversation, and I really appreciate that. So my question has something to do with that. In our current capitalist environment, where especially in schools, the idea of competition seems to be encouraged through grades and other forms of assessments, to where it makes sense to try to do better than others rather than help others. How have you, in your experience, thought about alternative forms of assessment or ways that encourage us to think collectively? I'll just leave it at that.
Well, for us, we tried to design the school so that it was neither our task nor the students' task to be continuously comparing themselves to others. So the kind of ways we graded kids, and the kind of conferences we had with kids, the kind of conferences we had with families and kids, and the kind of graduation process that we used was designed so that would actually be hard to do. The graduation process at our high school, which then became the graduation process at Mission Hill, was more like a doctorate. You presented a body of work to a committee of people and you tried to defend that work. They had seen it ahead of time. They could ask you questions. You presented parts of it. And it makes it hard to compare two people who are who presented a different body of work to a different committee. And we found ways to translate that for colleges that was very successful, especially after a few years when they realized that our graduates were much more thoughtful than they generally find. And so I think there are ways to design it so that it's just not easy to figure out how to compare people, and in which it's not the task of the teacher nor the student to compare to rank order. Testing is built on the notion of rank order. It's what produces the biases within tests and the irrelevancy of many of its questions. It's built on a system of comparison, a rank ordering. And if something doesn't work properly in the rank ordering, they throw that item out. So items that people who shouldn't get high scores, they get right more often than the ones who should get high scores, that item is thrown out. It's the assumption that we have to have a way of rank ordering each other. And that's a permanent disservice. You know, if you ask all the kids in the playground to line up, there's always going to be one at the end of the line and one at the beginning, and half in the back half and half in the front half. And I think that's a part of our educational system that we have to dispose of.
Comments on this?
Thankfully, I do believe we're moving toward a time where there's more student ownership into their performance. And I think I'm seeing that K plus, you know, even through university level. I think that ownership shift is being from, we got to focus on the parents, or we got to focus on that competition, the class rank. I see people starting to move away from that into more students are taking more ownership into their education and their performance and their growth. And I would say that goes right back to the classroom teacher and the atmosphere and the environment that you set up, or the school administrators. You know, we went from class ranking where, you know, for graduation you had to rank your kids because Indiana says you have to have a rank on a transcript, and universities love that. We went back to the Latin system where you ended up where you ended up, and it was all on you, and you're not trying to outrank anybody and play games with your GPA and play games with your schedule and that whole competition that wasn't healthy for anybody in that regard. So I think it's really driven by the leaders in a school, whether it's the classroom teacher or whether it's the administration. It is hard this day and age because we preach a lot of teamwork and a lot of collaboration and a lot of, you know, the 4 C's, and we're really trying to push that. And when it comes down to it, sometimes naturally it becomes competitive, and sometimes you don't mean it necessarily to go there. So it's tricky. As a classroom teacher, that is tricky, but I think, too, shifting that ownership onto the student, celebrate when you need to celebrate, because I sometimes don't think we do enough of that, but good, honest feedback along the way, and it's ongoing. So many times, back in the day when I was in school, it was very scripted on when that feedback came and how it came, and it wasn't very competitive. So that can be driven by all of you in that classroom.
Oh, good.
Thanks. So I have a question, but I wanted to make one comment about the question about textbooks and your question about inquiry. So really, it's a question of, are the students in there to acquire information or to inquire? And keeping that distinction is really important. And what Debbie was talking about was inquiry. And when we say, well, the new teacher is trying to pull all materials together, it's a problem. But the teacher shouldn't have to pull materials together. It should be an issue of presenting a problem, engaging the students in inquiry, and let them learn how to think about what materials are relevant. So I think if we change our mindset of the role of the teacher as a coach in inquiry, as opposed to providing material to be acquired, I think we get a much bigger win. Okay, but on to the question. Which goes to the technology. You wanted to talk about technology before, and this is primarily for Jennifer. I'm curious, as you've gone across the state, because technology is a thing, right? It can be good, bad, and pointed out kids can screw themselves up for jobs by the social inquiry part, which we really do need to teach them. But from your travels across the state, I'd like to have you tell us what you think are an example of a good use of technology in the classroom, and something you've seen that you don't think should be occurring. And perhaps, if we can do it 2 by 2, talk about it in terms of, you said that the technology is important for equity purposes. So for the regular classroom, as well as for students needing extra support, the good and the bad.
What I don't like to see, 75% of our districts, so kids pay attention if you're getting ready to leave us to go into a job in a school. 75% of the districts in Indiana have some one-to-one. So somewhere in that school you have one-to-one. 25% of our districts are one-to-one K-12. That is very different now. That's a very different classroom than what it was when I taught. And, it's just different. Whether we like it or not, it lends itself to different opportunities and different issues. So that's kind of interesting. Some of the equity opportunities that have been afforded to students, one, they have access to courses they wouldn't have had, because sometimes you get into environments where you can't find certified teachers to teach those courses, and they finally have access to those courses. Sometimes it is a matter of, I know for some of our students who speak English as a second language, it is very, very difficult across the state for us to get some of those instructors. And so we are we are the next best option. Obviously, an instructor in that area is always your first best option, but sometimes that's not even available. So at least we have some programs that help those students. We also know too that tie between curriculum, instruction, and assessment that technology sometimes lends to us can be a real game changer for some of our students. Sometimes that's not the end all be all, but there are times where that is helpful. So I think when I see it as far as our textbooks are on the laptop and that's what it's used for, I think that is a waste of money. So that's frustrating in my world. Now, there are others who think that's the best thing ever. So, but there are just different uses that are going across the state. Project Lead the Way is another example that technology it makes that possible to expose students to some of those engineering classes and biomedical classes that we probably wouldn't have that opportunity for some of our students. So is technology the only answer? Absolutely not, but it's here. If you question me, give me your cell phones, you don't need them anymore. Give me your laptops. That's technology, and so the purpose you use them for is very individualized, but it's part of our lives and it's not going away. So to ignore that for our students would be a big, big disservice. Indiana is one of the forefront states regarding technology, and I will say we're getting much better at integrating it into instruction and helping us with curriculum and really utilizing it, being smart with the assessment. But when we start looking at those in pillars regarding technology, that's when it gets dangerous, in my opinion, where you say, okay, we're going to send the kid to the lab for 45 minutes and that's their technology for the week. That can no longer happen. I think that's a bad practice. And so in making sure we're doing a smart job with integration, having access to things that our students wouldn't have had before. Some of our speech pathologists are doing some awesome things with certain pieces of technology that I've seen regarding apps or direct communication for students who can't come on site because of whatever purpose. So good and bad, going on with technology. But I'm more supportive than I'm not supportive of that, because I think the opportunities it affords to some of our students is amazing, but it is a lot to put on teachers. And that's a skill base that you can't over-assume.
Could I say one thing about this question about new teachers? We did a lot of, in the high school, the teachers who taught the same subject, in a sense, met together, so the new teacher was never inventing alone. She was inventing with colleagues who were more experienced and who were supportive of each other. So I think it's important for us to think about how we get support for teachers inside the school in a way that's useful for all teachers. I think even very experienced teachers have much to learn from each other.
Just got a couple of minutes left, maybe one more question. Kathy?
I'd like to hear the answer for, when we're talking about schools as democratic institutions, one of the things that I think of as public education, what makes it public, is the publicly elected school board and being accountable to the public through that. I'd like to know what you think the role of school board members are.
I was on my local school board. I was elected to my local school board during the period in which New York was trying to decentralize and give more power to its local school boards. It was in that kind of situation, it was, I think, hard for us to figure out what the difference was between the role we need to play and the central staff of the district. And it's tricky because you don't have the amount of knowledge they have, and you're very dependent upon a professional staff to give you the knowledge. So I think it's easier in small towns where you over the time you get to know who the school board is and what the schools are. There were 21 schools that I was the school board member for decisions in 21 schools, and therefore I wasn't very experienced. I knew 4 or 5 of them very well. I knew the one my children went to. But I do think that we need to explore ways in which school boards can be more supportive of decision making in the school. And I'm not sure. I'm certain I'd like to hear what you have to say there. I think it's easier to do, obviously, in a small community where everybody knows each other and knows each other's schools. But even there, I now live in upstate New York in a small town. Even there, it's a tricky relationship, but I think it's a central one. Whereas in a lot of charter chain schools, for example, and certainly the voucher systems that they're proposing, the board of directors has nothing, it's a corporate model. And I think we should not follow the corporate model. We should follow a democratic model. And I think we're in a very dangerous moment now in history of the schools, whether we give up the idea of public institutions for corporate models.
Jennifer, you've obviously had experience as a school superintendent working with school board, so there you go.
So I will be honest, I was very fortunate. I had a good board. I had a good, educated, supportive board who were not on it to get coaches fired or to build Taj Mahals or to make sure we had dirt floors. So I've seen the whole gamut. So I was very fortunate. I had a really good school board. So 7 years, I was very, very lucky. But I have heard stories and I've seen it firsthand. I've now visited a lot of new school boards. And I tell you, that's not always the case. And so it's interesting because I think it's a good pulse on the community. I always ask the board, like, what are you hearing? And it was more of a partnership. But that's when you have a good board. And obviously I knew they were my boss. I knew I was accountable to them. But it was a very healthy relationship. It's when it becomes unhealthy that it really is problematic because you get educators and kids stuck in the middle of that mess. And so it becomes really, really hard to deal with. Indiana predominantly has elected, but there are some appointed boards still in Indiana across the state. And that is very interesting. Some of us have 5, some of us have 7 members, and so that gets interesting as well. You know, I've had a lot of people say, why do we still have to elect when the universities who receive our public monies appoint? And that's another interesting, I mean, just things to think about. You also have a state board of education that is 100% appointed. So just interesting. I mean, it's just, not that there's good and bad, but I completely agree. If you have a good board, it's powerful. It is powerful because those are your voices of your community. But when it's a disaster, boy, I gotta tell you, the school can feel it. It's not good.
Does the governor do the appointing when you say most boards that are appointed? Is that the governor?
The governor has the majority here in Indiana, and then the speaker of the House, and then the pro tem of the House and the speaker of the House and the pro tem of the Senate both have appointments. So it's predominantly appointed by the governor. Now they also have, it's interesting because we have to have some differing political affiliations on the board too, which I think is healthy. So it's not, in Indiana, it's not all 100% Republican. We have some Democrats that have been appointed, which not very many, but there are just a few. Now, if the governor changes, if you have a changing governor, you're going to have a predominantly, if the Democrats would win, then you would have a predominantly Democrat board with a few Republicans. It'll switch. So that's been interesting as well here in Indiana. That's our state board governance has really, really changed over the past 8 years.
See, we at Mission Hill, for example, we have there were a group of schools that they became what were called pilot schools, who were supposed to explore new ways of governance, among other things. And the governance we used at Mission Hill was that there were 5 representatives of the staff, chosen by the staff, 5 parents chosen by the parents, and then the parents and the staff together picked 5 community members, and then at some point we added 5 student members. And there was no critical decisions, we listed what those would be, could pass without at least 3 out of 5 members of each of these constituent groups, so that, in a sense, any one of the groups could block it. In the 20 years of the school's history, we've never been paralyzed by that. There's a process you go through if that happens, calling in outside help. But it was remarkably helpful to make everybody feel that they had the power. Ultimately, they were a powerful group. And so you could say to the parents, well, there's no decision of importance going to be made not about what goes on in the classroom, but any major changes in the school in which you don't have the power of veto, which relaxes people. So they were marvelous discussions. Anyone was invited to their meetings, and I think it's an interesting approach is to imagine if schools had their own school boards. And that there's some central board, it's in a city like Boston, which monitors the process, but leaves most decisions, including the decision about who becomes principal, to the constituents of the community itself.
Yeah, and interesting in Indiana, we can't do that unless we're a charter, public charter, or we are in a takeover situation. So as a state of Indiana, it's frustrating because we have to be in trouble before we are allowed that flexibility.
Yeah. No, in Boston, this was a decision that apparently the superintendent of Boston, Tom Payson, was able to make with the union.
Yeah.
The union, this was actually proposed by the union, the pilot schools. And now I think he did it in part to compete with the charters, to see how you could have in-district, essentially in-district charters, how you could make the district a district in which a lot was not rested upon the individual charters. And after all, with charters, I think a majority of charters are part of chains where the schools are, in a sense, franchises, like McDonald's. And that doesn't leave a lot of autonomy to the individual school. So I think we've forgotten that the charter law in most states allows decisions to be made by the board of the charter chain, the charter organization. Is that true? No?
Some of it is. It depends on what kind of charter you are. So in Indiana, we have several districts, public school districts, that are now starting charters that are within the public schools. So our school boards are still in control of those. And then other charters who are outside of the public school districts that are not sponsored per se, that have other management systems over them, they have, many of them have appointed, but we do have a charter state board of education and a state board of education here. So we've muddied it as much as we can muddy it here in Indiana. We need your help. You want to come over? We'll take you. Come on over.
So we've ended.
I was planning to come over.
Yes.
Maybe next time.
Well, we certainly hope that next time, yes, that you'll be able to join us in person. You know, we've ended up here with a discussion about school boards, but before that, we've covered a lot of territory, I think, in our discussion today about the challenges and the issues that educators face, that teachers face, that we all are engaged in, whether it's at the university or in other capacities. And I really want to end our session today by thanking all of you for coming, by the way. I think this is a great turnout. Thanks for being here for this, and particularly Dr. Meier and Dr. McCormick for coming and sharing, your wisdom and expertise and commenting and sharing your ideas about how we move forward productively together and improve the conditions for schools and for students in our state and in our nation. So thank you so much. This is a wonderful event. Thanks to everyone for coming.
Hey, no, yeah. You guys got my stuff on Monday? I think so. I sent it to you.